Sometimes I feel that people don't have the imagination of how impact actually happens.
Everything I give has to go to the donee. You don't follow that in the corporate world.
One of the things that we see with the companies that have got this right is that they recognize that it's good for business and it's good for the society.
Somewhere the entire social sector will be a must-have sector. Today it's a nice-to-have sector. Recently when a not-for-profit came, the first company, I don't take a salary from this NGO. So I said, I don't want to talk to you.
India ranks 4th in the number of ultra-high net worth individuals globally today. There is an emergence of domestic philanthropy landscape in India that is going to shape the way impact happens, be it through CSR, be it through family philanthropy, or be it through systems change initiatives. Govind Iyer is somebody who sits at the intersection of all of these ecosystems, and it is a privilege for all of us to hear him speak about how some of these ecosystems are evolving. Govind, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks Rathish for having me here today. Looking forward to an interesting conversation.
See, I think Govind, there's a lot of curiosity on how domestic philanthropy is evolving. There is the emerging CSR landscape, the 10,000 crores that is happening. There is a growing number of individual philanthropists that are, committing to impact today. And there is bold bets taken around how systemic impact has to be there. I don't know a lot of people who are part of all the three ecosystems as you are. You've had this vantage point at a leadership level across all of these ecosystems, and you work with a lot of nonprofits as well. And the reason I wanted to have you and have this conversation is because a lot of people see this from the outside. But you've had a vantage point of seeing this from the inside. We are able to see what are the changes, what are the conversations, and have that longitudinal view now over a decade in terms of how things are changing as well. So my core objective of success is today to be able to understand that view from you. Given you work with leadership, and this is a conversation people in the sector have a lot about, because it is a determinant of success for any organization. How do you see that apply both in professional firms and in the social sector?
So I'll tell you the one common thread that I don't think is differentiated, and I'll give you examples so that there's a tangible outcome I can have in this conversation. I think the first thing about leadership in an institution is about who surrounds the leader, whether it's at the chairman level, whether it's the board for listed companies, or whether it's the leadership team.
Right.
So I did some analytics during my journey at Econ Zen, and I looked at all the CEOs that I've hired, and I tried to see who in my book was a success. So just so I'm clear about it, success for me is not only metrics. It's also followership. It's also value you've given to people in the organization, which is not quantifiable. So like, for example, if I look at ICICI, I think I produce some of the best leaders in the country. Under Mr. Kamath, every single direct report of his has either become a CEO or is leading a business of their own. So to me, leadership is about definitely market cap, definitely profits, definitely share gain, but it's also about impact on the ecosystem around you. I put them into 3 buckets. Those that delivered huge returns, but did it by using the people that they had. So in other words, they didn't mind discarding where not required. I rank them as successful on business, but not successful leaders. And the second group of leaders I looked at were those that built businesses well, but also nurtured a lot of leaders within to go out. That, to my mind, was starting to get towards gold status. And the third is where I saw leaders actually building succession organizations. So to me, a good leader will have their own successor.
Right.
So it's okay if you're a leader and you have a lot of people and none of them has ever took a job. It means you are insecure about preparing somebody to get ready.
Correct.
Or if they prepared somebody but they left earlier, it means you have not timed your ability to get that person into the role.
Right.
I go to the social sector, no different. If I look at Akanksha, great example. Started by Shaheen, outstanding founder, outstanding success, then led by Vandana, who was reporting to her. Succession happened. So to me, companies like that are hugely successful. I think you were referring to also Sattva earlier, and I think having stability in leadership defines a lot of success of a leader. The last commonality I'd say between leadership in the social sector, leadership in is the ability to think ahead, to disrupt yourself, if I had to use that term, or to say, instead of worrying about whether somebody else will get share, let me go and get a higher share by doing something different for myself.
Personally, as a reflection also, Govind, it's been the case that in every organization, there are people who run the business and who grow the business. And those who grow the business are already saying, I don't want to get caught in what we're doing today. I want to step back and see what we have to do. And the number of leaders in an organization who can grow the business is usually a marker of how far and sustainable as the business is going to
Very
be.
well put.
Right? And
Very
I think
well
that's
put.
very, very critical. Govind, one of the things that we are seeing is the rise of wealth in India. Right? India ranks today 4th in the number of ultra high net worth individuals globally. The wealth of rich Indians has actually increased by 58% over the last 2 years. And more, the number of high net worth individuals is growing. This also is translating slowly into greater intent to giving. At the same time, the relative wealth that Indians give is much lesser to other countries. Like we are at 0.1% of our wealth, while other countries are actually above 1% or more. And so there is this growing divide where there is wealth that is growing, but the willingness to give that is still not grown as much. You work with a lot of philanthropists today. In these conversations, are you getting a sense of what is holding them back? From the outside, it often seems like intent doesn't always translate to action because of lack of awareness, but it is also because lack of trust. Sometimes you don't know who to trust, etc. as well.
Definitely.
What have been some of your learnings in seeing some of these journeys happen? Where are emerging, I'm not talking about the Premjis of the world and the Nandans of the world.
Yeah.
The median Indian giver, where are they today? What is holding them back from giving and what is accelerating their ability to give?
So I think you've already raised the two very important points, Rathish. I think trust is a big factor. For a variety of reasons, people believe that in the not-for-profit ecosystem, there isn't dependability and reliability with impact. Impact and utilization of funds.
Right.
When I was doing a fundraiser for COVID on the Give India platform in 2020, and I sent out a broadcast to my friends to say, contribute to this entire migrant movement that's happening. And I had a really lovely friend, a friend I've known for many years, call me and say, Govind, happy to contribute, where will the money go? So I said, how much do you intend to contribute? So he said, 10,000 rupees. So I said, I'm really happy you're doing it. Let's start with that. Second is, Give India is recognized. I've never heard of them, but they're a recognized institution. They have a good process of identifying NGOs and they'll do it well. And I'm also on the board. Oh, you're on the board? Okay, take the money. Without a question, the credibility of the individual made a difference to the giving. So what I've realized, that's one big factor. If many of us can identify not-for-profits and lend ourselves the credibility of their success, giving will go up. And we've seen that at Social Venture Partners, Rathish, that you mentioned. In the last 3 years, we've had the good fortune of exposing around 35 not-for-profits to a variety of different that do a variety of different causes, to an ecosystem of about 1,000 people who have not SVP partners but just friends of SVP, and we've raised over 55 crores just from them.
Wow!
And they give it. They know it's for a good cause. They know because SVP partners are engaged with them. So the trust coefficient. So to me, the trust coefficient is what we need to solve for. But trust leading to dependability of outcomes. So for example, one of my belief systems is that if every not-for-profit at some stage, may call it 5 years, just throwing a number, can choose to have a board.
Right.
It could be an advisory board or statutory board, doesn't really matter. But a board of friends, influencers and leaders that impact. I think that's a high watermark.
Yeah.
The next watermark could be, can you have consistent donors?
Yeah.
3+ years the same person's giving. That's another mark of people believing in your cause for a longer period of time.
Correct.
So I think as we go forward, Rathish, we should start focusing on these markers. Then that will drive confidence to say that, do you know that top 500 NGOs in the country have had the same funder for 70% of their funding?
Yeah.
Now that automatically means that somebody is believing in them and they are not fools to believe in that.
Right.
These things we are not publishing. We are not publishing this fact. We are not publishing how many have boards. We are not publishing how many have. That is an opportunity for us to build more trust in the ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And the second thing, which I'm sure you'll cover later, but let me bring it up now, is this entire feeling of, everything I give has to go to the donor, donee.
Yes.
And my belief system is you don't follow that in the corporate world. Everything I give doesn't go for utilization only. It goes for building infrastructure. It goes for building capacity, building capability. So I think that's the other pivot we need to do. We need to get people to believe that no institution can be built without investment. If we believe that in the not-for-profit world, nobody needs to take any salaries, nobody needs to work for money, how will they lead a livelihood?
Correct.
If it was your children, if it was you, and you started at 25 or 28 and 30 and said, I'm not taking any salary, how are you going to live this world?
Yeah.
So somewhere we need to get people to recognize there should be reasonable approach to that in terms of cost game, but it cannot be a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Yeah.
It cannot be that, like recently when a not-for-profit came, the first comment is, I don't take a salary from this NGO. So I said, I don't want to talk to you. I said, if you don't, how long is it sustainable?
Yeah.
How long is it sustainable? At some point, you're going to wake up, right? And they were shocked because she was trying to get the message across, my overheads are low. I think that's not a good signal.
At all.
That's not a good signal at all as we look at growth in the sector. I think we need to be conscientious. We need to be careful. I don't think that necessarily means that we need to be, saying that that's a metric for success.
Yeah.
The metric for success, to my mind, is the beneficiary impact, the leadership piece I talked about, the board construct, the thought leadership. Those should be measured. I would prefer for donors to ask me all those questions.
Correct.
As a not-for-profit leader, then ask me what is your cost structure.
And just building on your point, it's a very different example. I once asked a startup founder why he started advertising. He said, the moment I started advertising, my talent found it easier to convince their parents that this is a legitimate company. Even Flipkart started advertising because it became easier to convince talent to join them because they see it on TV.
It's a great point.
So what is the marker for legitimacy is very important, and the point that you made is so important that giving is still a personal decision. So even if you set up a social stock exchange, and I'm sure it's going to thrive at some point, it is still a personal choice of, I know Govind is part of this board, how do we figure that out, etc. And one of the advice I always have to nonprofits also is that if you want to build financial capital, build social capital.
Completely
Who
correct.
are the 50 people who will vouch for you in the system, because they will then get the fund, even if they don't give you the money.
They'll be influencers,
Exactly, and I think that's very, very critical. I want to sort of build on the second point that though you mentioned, and which I think is something that SVP does well. Sometimes I feel that people don't have the imagination of how impact actually happens. So they think of a non-profit like a pipe, which is that यहाँ पे पैसा डालो तो वहाँ पे पहुँच जाएगा, which is the poor person will get the money. Because of which you think everything is a transmission loss. So anything that doesn't reach the poor person is transmission loss.
It's true.
Because you don't realize that it's not a money problem. It's also a problem of capacity building. It's also a problem of talking to government. It's also a problem of training, etc. And you need people to do that. I feel one of the things I see with people who've been in SVP is that since they meet NGOs, NGO leaders, look at NGO programs, while they start from a high level of information asymmetry, after 1 year, they realize that, wow, this is a complex problem. I didn't appreciate that. Is that something that you see as well?
Oh yeah. I went through that experience. I went through the worst day of my life. It was, I think, 2013, first quarter. I was in Bangalore for one of the SVP events, and I was in Mumbai, but I was a partner in Bangalore.
Right.
And I was in SVP, what they call all partner meeting, with about 20 of us in the room. And there was a fabulous not-for-profit that presented, got me tears in my eyes on the impact they were doing. And I, in my usual corporate bigwig guy, stood up and asked a question saying, you're doing such amazing work. I'd love to help. What can you do to grow this to the next level and the impact you have, right? To my mind, it seemed like a simple question. About 5 days later, 7 days later, I spoke to the CEO of the Chairperson and said, what happened? Are we taking that NGO? They said, no, they don't want to work with us. So I said, oh, tell me more. So they said, because of the question you asked. I said, okay, what did I do wrong? I'm like, I had to go back. They said, they aren't able to make ends meet for tomorrow and day after. They've come to us because they want us to build a capacity. Here you're talking about trying to build one big mountain when they haven't even crossed over. They've said, these are the kind of partners, we don't want to work with them. Because they haven't understood us. They haven't. To me, that was a moment of unlearning for me, Rathish. Right. It was like a brilliant moment to say, go and got to get off a high horse, you've got to understand the sector before anything else. And that's the thing we try our very best to do with our partners. So therefore, in the first couple of months, I remember I was in one meeting with the grants committee with one of my partners. And after the NGO left, he says, but where's the ROI on this? So I said, there is no ROI in the social sector. There is ROS, return of social capital, not return. No, but at some point they should make money. I said, they will not make money. That's what now that is the orientation people walk in with.
Exactly.
And I don't blame them for it, because that's all we've lived with.
Correct.
We've all lived with ROI, ROCE. My biggest satisfaction is when I see the number of people who say, we thought differently when we walked in, we're thinking differently now. To me, that's transformation.
One of the things I keep thinking of is what will unlock giving at scale. And just absence of these platforms where, it's like a dating before marrying type thing, right? Today, either you give money or you don't give money, but it's already a transaction with a high overhead. Like you said, there are questions of trust. Spaces where leaders can engage with nonprofits without having to commit, saying, I am going to give money. Absence of that spaces for listening, learning, engaging, it's I think one of the critical problems, and I don't think we have an at-scale platform to be able to do that today.
Not yet. No, I agree with you, Rathish. I look at the mutual fund industry. It's a fantastic example of late. Until about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't know when the mutual fund Sahi campaign started, the SIP, systematic investment plan market is really low. Look at the build-up of the industry in India.
Yeah.
Today, Indian stock market doesn't depend on financial foreign institutional investors.
Correct.
As their means of, there was 20 years ago, that was the case. Now, if there's somebody who took on the campaign to say, I'm going to make philanthropy core to our sector and not an adjunct, when that investment happens, Rathish, to your earlier point on Flipkart, right? If the advertising happens and people say the social sector is an sector which is actually no longer cottage industry, it's become an industry, I think that's when the catalytic change will happen.
Kickoff will happen.
I'm seeing that with many organizations I work with now that are working with government. The government, I mean, from 5 years or 8 years ago, the number, like you said, you're working in so many governments, right?
Yeah.
10 years ago, I'm not sure you were at the same penetration stage.
At all.
It's a journey. And I think a lot of the state governments and the central government are a lot more willing to now engage with individuals like yourself and others to talk about social change. 15 years ago, I'm not sure that that appetite was there because they have different agenda. I think in the same way, the next 15 years, I'm hoping that when if we're sitting here 10 years from now, this will not be a conversation we're having. Correct. Because somewhere the entire social sector will be a must-have sector versus the nice-to-have sector. Today, it's a nice-to-have sector.
Yeah.
I would do it to sort of round off my life.
Correct.
Whereas making it core to your life is what I would love to do.
Yeah. So we worked with a financial services company based out of Switzerland. They used to provide a 6-month program for one of their staff member to go and solve a social problem.
Brilliant.
And they came back and said that the business ROI they got out of that business.
There you go.
It's massive.
Yeah.
Succession planning, because 6 months the person is out. This person comes out with a set of completely new ideas to solve the same business problems. Their understanding of risk has changed because they're a financial services organization. I'm saying the business ROI is very, very clear. How do we, and the same thing, right? Because that individual now will go tell 100 people about their stories of impact. And then it starts to translate into something more effective.
Like if you take the CSR Act, 2013, that's changed the way organizations at least are thinking towards community impact, right? I wonder whether in 2026, 27, 28, we can have a volunteering act.
Yeah.
Which to say every employee, every company must get its employees engaged in volunteering in some form or fashion.
Right.
If we do that, that's going to change the approach towards the sector.
One of the things that I think non-profits are still not doing enough to look at that side is also the fact that volunteering is treated as an overhead to deal with a corporate.
Oh, completely.
You know, in Bangalore, there is actually a wall that anyone who comes to volunteer for them will be asked to paint. So there are like 55 coats of paint on that wall. It's like, do something and go away.
Yeah.
Because they're like, hey, this is the cost of engaging with a corporate, but engagement of a volunteer is not thought through. And similarly, I
agree with you. That's an opportunity.
You know, and also I feel that even the product, like what do you fund? The storytelling that nonprofits do on the impact they create and what people can fund, especially in early journeys, I still feel like it's a lot more inward focus to say, hey, this is what I do. How do you build that scaffolding for donors, especially when they're new to the sector? I feel is also a space where, and I know SVP works on narrative, storytelling, pitching, etc. as well, but I still feel that's a space where corporate nonprofits have still not warmed up to recognizing how domestic philanthropy is working. You know, because there is a change of guard, etc. But I don't know if you see that in your work as well.
No, I do see that in my work. I'll go to the for-profit side.
Please.
Right? So I think this is a very good point you make, Rathish. And I think narrative telling, I was talking to one not-for-profit leader yesterday, and I said, what's your purpose? What's your focus? Education. I said, okay, you're going to pitch education to Foundation A. Yeah. I said, they don't do education, they do livelihoods. So who does education? I said, but you do livelihood. No, we don't. I said, yes, you do education, then you get people the rural employment. Rural employment, and you make them successful entrepreneurs. Yes. I said, that's livelihood. But you are talking of the input of education and not the outcome of livelihood.
Correct.
I said, pitch yourself the outcome of livelihood because you're so passionate about your education, so you're not seeing that the other person is not able to jump and say it's livelihood.
Yeah.
So they repurposed their presentation, shared with me again, and started with, this is what our intent is, to create 1 million entrepreneurs. Now let's go backwards to say, how are we doing it? And they got the grant, right? Now, because they looked at it from a lens of the donor and their connect versus, and I don't think it's misleading the donor at all.
At all.
I think it's just positioning it appropriately so that both sides understand each other.
Yeah. 2014, we started with the CSR journey, and over the last 12 years, we've actually invested 2.2 lakh crores of CSR money on social impact today. And it's interesting because in the first year, I remember we had over 65% of the company spend 0% of their CSR investment. And today, 57% of the companies are actually spending more than the 2% that they have to spend. I think roughly about 782 companies are spending double the amount of money that they have to actually spend. So it's 200% more. And I think there are about 392 companies, if I'm not wrong, that are actually spending CSR investments even though they don't have to, you know. And increasingly more and more in conversations, the large companies are looking to see how they can strategically invest in a few areas and create differentiating value, and looking at it as part of their strategy as a company than just impact. At the same time, there is a long tail of companies that are still looking to see how they can align their goals to, you know, CSR and the government's agenda and so on. You are somebody who's had a chance to be part of conversations with corporate boards and corporate leaders on how to look at impact. From your vantage point, Govind, how do you see some of these conversations evolving?
First thing, you use the word CSR investments, which I love. I hear CSR spend a lot.
Right.
And I do get a little irritated by that. Spend is normally used when you use it as a means to say, I've got to do it, so I'll do it in whichever way. Investment is strategic. So I think if there's some way to pivot this conversation to say CSR investment in the social sector, I think that'll be the first thing that I would love corporates to do. I'd love the entire narrative to be around investment versus spend. And thanks for using that word. The second thing, what I'm seeing is, I think a lot of organizations look at CSR as, I think, with an increasing lens of saying, what can we do right? How can we do it well?
Right.
But they're in disproportionate focus on compliance, which is good. From where it started to today, there's a lot more compliance-oriented CSR work to ensure that the NGO is correct, the NGOs met all the boxes, ticked all the boxes, I visited them, they exist, they are doing the right thing. Can we go one step further now in the next 5-10 years and say, if that box is ticked, how can I make sure that that NGO is actually working on systemic change? How can I commit? So for example, the first thing I would like to suggest to donors is, don't make one-year investments. Look at 2 years or 3 years, ideally 3, which will allow your donation to see the best value. In other words, we are committed to a 3-year journey. I would love to see that pivot happening across the industry. That's the first thing. And if you can't give too much, give 1/3 of it, that what you can give every year. But giving a large grant actually to not-for-profit is detrimental.
Right.
Because if I get a crore from you today, and next year I got to hunt for the next that crore, it takes a lot more effort for me to hunt it. But you say I'll give you 33 lakhs every year, I'll build my capacity for that 33 lakh absorption. So I think systematic growth in not-for-profits is very critical.
Right.
The second thing I'd say is, can I make my CSR leader to say, you got donations confirmed. You're getting donations every year. Can you take that donation and make it meaningful on the ground? So don't hold them accountable for spending it.
Right.
Hold them accountable for saying, what's that donation delivering to the market?
One of the things that we see with the companies that have got this right is that they recognize that it's good for business and it's good for the society. Right?
Yeah,
and
I agree with you.
Whoever is able to see that business integration with impact, I think their way of looking at CSR is often very, very strategic. And they automatically realize that these one-year investments to a wide range of organizations is not making any sense, because, like you rightly said, nonprofits then hold back from taking bold bets.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
One of the other things that we are seeing is also this idea to move away from a program focus to a problem focus. You know, my experience of working with Infosys, you know, whose board you are in, is also that, hey, now they're stepping back and saying, what is the problem we are solving?
Yeah.
You know, now part of solving that problem is working with X number of partners, doing long-term grants, etc. But the problem of enabling sustainable livelihoods is becoming the problem that they have to own up, and they're also asking the question of, what problem am I best placed to solve? Right? Is that something that you're seeing in your conversations?
Increasingly, but it's happening where I'll be also very categorical and say, where there's an outstanding person who's committed to the CSR journey. So this quality of the CSR leader is making a huge difference to organization CSRs.
Right.
People need to view it as a C-suite conversation, not a conversation which is done by somebody because they have to spend the 2%.
Correct.
Because it's not about the 2%, just to be clear, Rathish. It's about an organization's responsibility to this community.
Yeah.
This 2% is one way of getting there.
Correct.
You were telling me that there are many companies who are doing much more than that.
Yeah.
So over time, and what we also forget is, if we can embed in our employees, even 20% of them, the ability to give more of their time, more of their volunteer, and more of their money This 2% will become 4% in no time from an institution.
100%.
So if you look at the top 500 people in the organization, say, are they giving to philanthropy? The answer is yes, because they've got engaged through the institution.
Correct.
So they're giving. So I think somewhere that's never captured. We can't capture that number, but we can just believe in that proposition that if I educate my top 500 leaders in an organization on what it takes to make a difference, they will give it in their own way.
And I think the point that you made about how that is a CXO conversation is very important. You know, one of the things that we were talking about as well is that it's not just a CXO, it has to be the CEO mandate in some sense to think about what is impact. And I was sharing with you this narrative, this anecdote that somebody told me that they used to be sitting in the same floor as the CEO. And the strategic value of CSR was much higher than when they got demoted to another floor. And the point that you made that a CEO should own that larger agenda, I think is a very, very important conversation. And I think structurally the good news is it is part of a board conversation. It is part of your profits. You are spending 2% money. So some of the legal enablers are there. And I think, again, as you rightly said, the roles of organizations like Sattva is to be able to see what can we do.
And that's because you guys have seen the story with so many organizations, right?
Correct.
How can you get your best practice learning to as many organizations out there?
From the law and from the board perspective, and you've been on the Infosys board, you're still on the Infosys board, Govind, are there some enablers that you think will make this accelerate? Like you rightly said, the movement is there, but the momentum is not there. Are there some things that you would say, hey, we should sort of double down on some of these?
I find that there is no forum for all CSR leaders to collaborate and cooperate. Now, they're not competing for anything because they've got their own donations coming in, right? Can we be an enabler on that very fast? So like, make it up that in 2 or 3 years from now, if I speak to somebody at any company, speak to somebody at Godrej or at Airtel or at HDFC, they will give me a good sense of what an Infosys is doing, what a Wipro is doing, what a TCS is doing. So I'm saying if I, for example, share all the projects that I've worked that are really successful with the entire ecosystem, with some qualitative dimension, the ecosystem will say, why do I have to go and qualify more? I'll just pick this project because this organization has to survive.
Correct. And it's funny you say this today because today morning I was talking to a CSR leader. He was talking about, forums like this that can exist, and he was giving me this example that there was a company wants to do affirmative action, looks around for tribal schools, and they're an IT company, don't have access to any tribal school. By the way, this CSR leader is working in 10 tribal districts for the last 20 years.
Brilliant.
Is there in tribal schools 365 days a year because they're building capacity. And he's like, one chance meeting got us to meet.
There you go.
And now they are actually collaborating where this organization is giving the digital tools and solutions, they are ensuring on-ground implementation. And he said, if the chance meeting hadn't happened, this collaboration would have never done. So, and the point is, how can we signal opportunities where connections like this can happen, replications can happen? I think
we need to find a platform to do that. No, I agree with you. I mean, in a very small way, at Social Venture Partners, I was going around the countryside a couple of weeks ago, and I got 10 not-for-profits in Delhi together. Firstly, we had not got them together for a long time, so they all weren't connected. One was doing work with the blind, another one was providing vitamins to the blind, and the third one was providing education to it. They said 3 of us can collaborate. One was providing healthcare, one was providing education, one was providing livelihood. What stops us from collaborating at our level, right? Not funding them. And that meeting made that 3 of them meet each other and do it. So exactly what you say, I think we just need to find many more ways to do it. And I think we need to systematically, and that's where you're an institution that Sattva's, I think I'm very proud to be associated with it, but also it's going to make a huge difference, IPN. Can IPN be a channel to say every program that every CSR does that's very successful, as declared by the CSR champion, is put up there so that others can reach out to the CSR, or even without reaching out, go and talk to them and say, this has at least gone through its due diligence, gone through its success, and go.
Absolutely.
So I think there should be some platforms like that.
While we've been talking about philanthropy in isolation, if you really look at it, the social sector spending in India is actually 25 lakh crores, and 95% of that is actually government spending. So if you really look at the denominator as a welfare spending and look at what the numerator is, which is what philanthropy collectively gives, it's actually less than 5%, that is really coming in. And part of that is also today recognizing that unless the 5% money leverages the 95% investment by the government, it can actually not be very, very effective, right? So both across corporates and even in terms of domestic philanthropy, there are more and more conversations now with government and seeing what can we do to catalyze government's investments to become more effective, right? And that really brings us to this conversation on systemic impact, because a lot of times we try and solve a problem that we believe is visible and real. But what we realize is that the problem is something much larger that philanthropy may not have the ability to solve, but has the ability to catalyze. To give you an example, let's take education as a problem. You often think that, okay, providing scholarships or providing some coaching programs can help, but more you work in education, the more you realize that unless you figure out curriculum, unless you're figuring out a large scale capacity for teachers' ability to be developed, or unless you look at ways in which incentives for state, block, cluster level government officials can be changed, you're not really going to have large scale improvement in learning outcomes, And so then philanthropy moves from running another training program to actually saying, what can I do to influence government's ability to shape effective curriculum, ability to conduct better assessments, ability to build better middle management capacity in education systems. And some of these changes are becoming more and more relevant in philanthropy, and you are part of various initiatives and thoughts around how this systems thinking approach is integrating both in the ways non-profits are looking at their work, but also in the way philanthropy is looking at their work as well. Yeah, and I'd love to know from your vantage point, what are you seeing as potential trends in systems change work in philanthropy?
So for me, my love is still the grassroots. Okay, I must full disqualify, because I think that it's more touching the heart, right?
Of course.
But systemic will allow the catalyzing of impact to be much higher. So I think as a country with a large population and large issues, we need people to make bold bets for systemic change. But over the years, what I've seen, Rathish, is that I think system change is when you've solved the problem, like you said earlier, with a view to therefore build a larger institutional impact.
Correct.
So if let's say policy, let's take an example of FLN, let's take the NEP 22. That was a system change initiative for 6 or 7 years that a bunch of people did together with the education government.
Right.
Once the FLN policy was there, it's now allowed learning, and the latest Dasra report clearly shows that learning has gone up.
Yeah.
To me, that's system change. So it started from one place,
yeah,
pivoted with policy and implementation to driving impact in education. And the last one I would give you from my experience in system change has been this entire issue about, which is still early days, but I think women in the workforce. Women in the workforce will undergo change slowly and steadily.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest aha for me is when 4 companies that I know of, only 4, and there may be many others, but I only know of 4, decided to institute a different way of grooming leaders who are women in the organization, including childcare support at home, which is not unusual in the US.
Yeah.
Very unusual in India, right? At the corporate one, and I would say one system change that's happened is adding women independent directors to the boards. Today, most of the boards that I work with that are really progressive boards have not one, which is mandated by law, but have 2 or 3.
Right.
Because they found that the diversity of thinking is very different.
Absolutely.
When you break. So I think system change doesn't necessarily mean to be only restricted to a problem. It could be around changing the way something is happening,
Correct.
which is much better.
Absolutely. And I think my favorite example is the women labor force participation that you talked about, right? Today, I think 38% is the latest number of women are in the workforce. 0.5% are actually in salaried jobs. 0.5% of all women in India are in salaried jobs, which is a very, very small number. And if you look at why is that a problem, it's not a problem that women are not educated. Actually, today there are more women graduates than men in India today in colleges. But it's just access like childcare facility. It's access to mobility solutions that can actually work for them, for them to get to work and back. And it's about creating jobs in the right places, because a lot of what women do are actually unqualified care work.
Yes, correct. Completely.
And so, in that, some of these, as you rightly said, you can keep training the women and hope that they will get to better jobs, but that's not the problem. The problem is somewhere there. And your story of the village is a great example, because partly what happens, and this is also an important lesson for donors, is we want to see the direct line to impact. So we try and do the easiest thing that, okay, say train women, that's okay. But we don't want to take the harder problems that actually causes the greatest impact in some sense as well. And that's an important learning that I think we take back to the donor ecosystem to say, hey, where is the highest leverage going to come from? In the last part of our conversation, Govind, I wanted to talk to you about, how do we build the muscle of effective delivery with the non-profit organizations, right? And there are multiple aspects in which we are, I think, covering it. I mean, the one hand, you have a very large number of small non-profit organizations that are working today where there is a need for just better systems, better systems for compliance, better systems for measurement, better systems for on fundraising, etc. And you've been very kind to be part of Sattva's initiative around the India Partner Network, where we are working with over 2,500 nonprofits and helping them build such systems capability in a more effective way. And I know that's been one level. The other level is the growth of programs that are building capabilities of individuals within non-profit organizations to become better leaders. Organizations like ISDM, ILSS, etc. are running programs today that are actually helping us create better leaders who in turn then transform their ability to deliver better impact overall as well. Then there are initiatives today that are looking to see how can we enable some of the more promising organizations to achieve orbit shifting impact. Identify an organization that today is probably at a 30 crore working at large scale, but has a significant potential to grow to a 100 and 150 crore NGO, and providing them holistic support in helping them get through this orbit shifting journey is also very, very critical. While we use the word capacity building as a broad moniker to all of these things, a lot of this work is currently happening today. There are platforms emerging, there are capability building of leaders that are emerging, and there is holistic institutional support provided to large scale organizations as well. From the vantage point that you have today, how do you see this space evolve, and what are some of the nuances that you see as well?
So I think again, I look at two words here, capacity and capability. Capability is building more capability within yourself.
Correct.
Capacity is adding more to your system.
Correct.
So if I took Sattva, making your leaders better is capability.
Correct.
But saying I want to do an SAP rollout in the company to that I have better information management is capacity. Because I've bought now a new computer system, etc.
Exactly.
So for me, the two are firstly very different.
Right.
Okay. Many people in India focus on capacity and confuse with capability.
That's true.
Because capacity means I hire a fundraising expert. That's capacity building.
Okay.
But if I make our founders better narrative tellers, that becomes capability building.
Right.
At least as social venture partners, our belief is both, but our belief is more on capability
Than capacity.
than capacity, which is making resources you have work better for you.
Right.
Making people you have work better for you.
Right.
So, for example, I'm sure at Sattva you do offsites. How many NGO leaders will have the ability to say, let's spend 5 lakhs and go do an offsite with that team?
Yeah.
When your budget is 50 lakhs, 80 lakhs, 1 crore, or even the larger ones. They think hard about doing that. And to my mind, that's huge capability building of bonding the team, of getting you to understand each other. We should encourage that. We shouldn't ask them, why is that line item there? So to my mind, capacity and capability first starts with the mind of the donor.
Correct.
The donor should orient towards saying, what have you done in the last year to build your capacity and capability? The answer is nothing. Be worried about your donation the year after.
Yeah.
Because at some point you will max out. That same person cannot do the same thing over and over again. But the investment in capability is what is not tangible. The investment in capacity is tangible. Sometimes you want both to work simultaneously. Yeah. And I think as a donor, I would want to see what the capacity and capability has been in the last year or 2 years of your organization, which we should ask the question. If we don't ask that question, we are actually not being the right donor, because then we are saying all that we are worried about is the outcome. We don't care how that outcome happens. If half the people are dying on the way, we don't care. That's not social giving.
Correct.
That's not social responsibility.
No, very, very well put, Govind. And I was also, as you were speaking, thinking of the Toyota model versus the GM model.
Yeah.
General Motors essentially, I have transactional relations with my suppliers. If they do well, they do well. If they don't do well, they don't do well. And over a period of time, the deficiencies caught up. But Toyota said, if the ecosystem thrives, I thrive well.
Exactly.
They doubled down on their relationships. They invested in their suppliers. And a lot of times, I have had donors who ask me saying, their capacity or capability is not my problem.
So true.
We're having a transaction. If they're a good player, I will give them money. If they're not a good player, I'm not giving them money. But the thing is that if my impact is strategic, if my ecosystem is not thriving, my impact agenda is not thriving, is not still a conversation that many donors are willing to have, right? And the point that you said about maxing out, I think is a very real thing. And I think we're having this fallacy of choice saying, if not them, I'll get somebody else. But long-term partnerships are very, very hard to build, and hence building this Toyota mindset to giving.
Very true.
Right? Is going to be super important.
We were doing this program for the last 4 years called Fast Pitch, where in the first year and second year we were very excited about doing it and trained our leaders on how to talk and this narrative, and we got the money. Then we realized that they were getting a lot of donations to Fast Pitch, but we were not telling them how to use it. They got it, but we were letting them be on their own. And we said, no, that's wrong, because they've suddenly got this 25% of their annual grant was got in 1 hour and 10 minutes.
Wow.
Okay, just think of it from an NGO perspective. You don't have to go and do 15 pitches, you don't have to go and get 25 people, and most of that was unrestricted capital. Most of it was unrestricted, so they could use it. And we were not telling them how to do it. So what they would do, they'd use it for projects. They'd use it for rent. Starting last year, we said, no, pause. When you give the money, we want a work plan. We want to know how you're building capacity and capability. That has really pivoted their thinking, which we were not doing for 2 years. We started doing 2 years ago. That has really helped them to say, now how do I invest in capacity and capability? So your point about, as a donor, we have to take responsibility for that is very critical. Versus saying somebody else will do it, we don't have to do it.
Correct. Absolutely. And I think that it is an obvious necessity for you to be able to scale your impact, because when your ecosystem grows, you do. Tell us about your work at scale, because it's a fascinating initiative about building a cadre of nonprofits that are able to work at scale.
Yeah. So scale is still very early in its journey, and the focus of scale is really to try and get CSR to be systemic givers. Okay, that is the idea of scale. And a lot of what we talked about earlier is a mission that Vikram Bhatt, who leads Scale, is entrusted with. He just joined us a few months ago. And it's not an easy journey, because we have to change mindsets, we have to do it in the right way. But I believe we have many converts already in the industry. We just need to leverage those converts from the CSR ecosystem. And the biggest one we want to do is drive, you said policy earlier, try to see whether we can help the ecosystem get better on giving, on utilization, show that there's outcome that's predictable and measurable. And as long as it's there, this is what the role of Scale is going to be, is to drive thinking around this, to drive strategic change. We're not looking at short-term gains. We're looking at a 3 to 5 year horizon to make this transformation happen. That's what Scale is all about.
Excellent. And I think that's much required, because some of these are long games. You know, you can't play them short and fast in any way. Govind, I think you're at a very interesting place in this sector. I genuinely believe that there is the transition to the India-based rupee philanthropy that's happening. And the thinking, the mental models of philanthropists that we have today is going to shape the sector.
I agree with you, fully.
And you are at an unenviable position where you can actually influence some of those mindsets and thinking. And I'd love to stay in touch, get your learnings, etc. as you go through this, and see what we can do together to shape this more effectively.
Thank you for this opportunity. We hope to work more closely together.